All right, guys, so we are finally getting into the actual fighting of World War II as we enter into chapter 18. Once again, I encourage you guys to use the guided notes, fill out the guided notes as we go along. This version of the guided notes is a little bit different. I did terms and questions as a structure for this guided note format. There's so much going on in the reading. I felt like it was maybe a little bit better to separate all the terms out from the actual questions. But it's the same general sense. And once again, if you want to pause the video and copy the stuff down, up to you guys. Up to you guys. But anyway, into the actual fighting. And really, this video will focus in mostly on Europe in the opening years, and then it kind of ends right as the U.S. is entering the war. And the big question, of course, this chapter is seeking to answer is why we could call World War II a truly global conflict. And the reason is it involved all of the major powers yet again. The fighting stretched from the Arctic Circle to the South Pacific. It lasted 6 years. Led to the destruction of 2 cities with atomic bombs and a culmination of centuries of military technology. So, way more people actually die in World War II than World War One. Close to 60 to 75 million people die, according to, or it differs according to what sources you use. But we would go ahead and say 60 million will die in this war, and that number is, let's get the death toll for World War One. Is significantly higher than World War One, and about 40 million, 20 million deaths, and casualties was 40 million, 20 million deaths, and 21 million wounded. So about 10 million of those 20 were civilians. So we're talking about 3 times the amount of death, right? And supposedly World War One was the war to end all wars. Turns out it wasn't. It wasn't even the worst war of the first half of the 20th century, which is pretty amazing when you think back on this whole thing. All right, now let's get into it. What's going on? All right, now remember, Hitler invades Poland on September 1st, 1939, with columns of Panzer tanks. And here's a picture of the Panzer tank. Literally thousands of these tanks, supported by aircraft, break through Polish positions. They take 500,000 Polish as prisoners by a quick process of encirclement. It's 3 weeks and it's over. The invasion of Poland is over. All right, and this type of warfare is known as blitzkrieg, literally translated as lightning war. This is where we see tanks supported by the German Air Force, known as the Luftwaffe. All right, launched bombing raids, destroyed much of the Polish Air Force, and they just basically engaged in nonstop bombing of Warsaw. And Warsaw really can do nothing to stop this whatsoever, and they fall very, very quickly. All right, and Poland, as it's invaded by the east, will also be invaded. It's invaded from the west by the Germans going east. It'll be invaded from the east by the Russians going west. And basically, the Soviet Union will occupy eastern Poland, dividing it up and taking away its sovereignty. Also, Soviet Union will annex Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and 2 provinces of Romania. So this non-aggression pact that Hitler and Stalin had signed is in effect right away, right after they sign it. Literally within a couple weeks of signing this agreement, they are carving up Poland, and Poland, which is an independent state, is officially gone. Now, Poland and Russia have been enemies, gosh, for centuries. So it isn't anything new that the two would be at war, but it is new in the 20th century that a state which is clearly not as powerful as its neighbors will be completely overrun through overt aggression. And of course, the major world powers will not stand for that. Now, Germany was able to win so much in the first 2 years of the war by employing these blitzkrieg tactics, by constant bombing by air raids and huge tank divisions that are trapping and circling basically both fronts of the war, right? Remember, Germany cannot fight a 2-front war. And so they have to knock out one side very quickly and then turn to the other. Of course, Poland was kind of a symbolical victory because they knew that Russia was not going to necessarily invade from that direction. So even though they're attacking there first, it's really to provoke the West, to provoke France and Great Britain. And remember the French, they have the Maginot Line, right? This series of defensive structures and fortifications built up on their border. And so basically, we labeled the French strategy at this time the Sitzkrieg. They're just sitting behind the Maginot Line, waiting, basically trying to call Hitler's bluff. And Hitler says, you know what? We'll just go around you. And once again, they implement the Schlieffen Plan. They go around through neutral Belgium and drop down to the north. And they end up taking Paris very quickly. And at the Battle of Sedan, also known as the Battle of Ardennes Forest, Nazi tank forces of thousands are going to crash through and catch the Allies by surprise and basically fully go behind the Maginot Line. This small British army that is there to help the French, ends up getting pushed back to the town of Dunkirk. And this is the location where the British Army was trapped at the end of May 1940. You may have seen the film, all right? There's actually another great scene of that. Maybe we'll show it in class from the film Atonement, of the British soldiers trapped on the beach at Dunkirk. The British were able to evacuate close to 340,000 of the 400,000 troops that were there by small, basically, family lots, sport yachts, and small boats coming over from the southeast coast of Great Britain. But they do leave behind their weapons and supplies. And with their evacuation, surely, Great Britain will live to fight another day. But, it's a pretty big demoralizing defeat. France is completely lost, as you'll see, after Germany pushes through. Dunkirk's up here, near Calais. All right, Calais is kind of the closest point across the channel. They push south, and France falls, and they make the French actually sign a treaty of surrender in the same railroad car that the Germans had to surrender in at the end of World War I. Now, the new government that is going to be inside of France is known as Vichy France, V-I-C-H-Y, Vichy France, and it will be basically a puppet state of the Nazis. Another France, rebellious France, I guess you could say true France, is headed by Charles de Gaulle. All right, after France surrenders on June 22nd, 1940, de Gaulle flees to the United Kingdom and basically, in exile, leads a government from there. All right, so true France is really up here in Great Britain, whereas much of France has been conquered through the taking of Paris and the pushing of the French army basically away, right? They completely overrun the country. And this is the major difference, right? In World War I, Germany never gets Paris. They never can quite get there without having to dig in or having their supply lines get too short. But this time with Blitzkrieg, with full implementation of airplanes and full implementation of tanks, we see that supply lines are able to be sustained, at least in terms of the German borders to Paris. Now we'll see that supply lines eventually get worn thin when the Nazi attack to Moscow takes place, and to Leningrad as well. All right, but the Nazi war machine is very effective, it's very fast, and it's able to strike a very decisive blow, not just in France, but through Yugoslavia, through Hungary, through Poland, through Czechoslovakia, and even up through Denmark, Norway, and basically they carve out an enormous piece of territory that encompasses the entirety of Europe except for Spain, neutral Spain, and then Italy, of course, is ruled by Mussolini, which is an ally to Great Britain. Now, the next target that Hitler will set his sights on is Britain. And Hitler never necessarily really wants to attack Britain. He actually sues many times for a truce, more or less, or an understanding that Europe is the way it is, and that basically there should just be an end of hostilities. And Hitler won't attack Great Britain, and Great Britain won't continue to wage war on mainland Europe. Well, Britain says no way. At this point, Winston Churchill, this guy right here, is in charge as the Prime Minister of the UK after Neville Chamberlain's government collapse, and he is as pugnacious as they get. You should listen to some of these speeches in 1940, especially one he delivers right after the evacuation of Dunkirk, pledging to fight in the streets and fight in the seas and fight and fight and fight till, nothing's left, right? The resolve of this man, of Churchill, is remarkable, and he really truly does rally his people, along with the king at the time, King George VI, to make sure that Britons know that they're fighting basically for their life. It's a life or death fight. And he's very, very influential in making sure that especially the British Air Force would do its job. But anyway, a Churchill-dominated Europe is not going to stand for any sort of status quo arrangement. And so what happens is Britain is attacked by the air in what is known as the Battle of Britain. Oh, by the way, this is a ship at Dunkirk, full of people, as you can see, people jumping off of them. If you really want to see what it was like, I would watch a movie, Dunkirk. It's amazing. But, even as boats, destroyers are getting evacuated, they're being sunk. And once again, just as soon as these men are off the ocean, they are back in the water. Anyway, the Battle of Britain. So the Battle of Britain was a air assault, all right? Germans never landed actual army troops in Great Britain, all right? The idea was to eventually do that, but initially the Battle of Britain was just to bomb the heck out of southeastern Europe, including London, and to basically destroy the morale and destroy the British Air Force, destroy the morale of regular English subjects, so they pushed Parliament to surrender. But it didn't work. Britain was able to withstand defeat by the Germans. Okay, they blockade the German vessels, and they send a small army to assist France, we've already talked about. The amazing leadership of Churchill and the amazing quality of fighting by British pilots saves the day, and Hitler is not able to take over Britain. This is kind of maybe the first time he's pushed back. Even though the battle lines don't necessarily change in Europe, the British are able to put forward a very large fight, a very effective fight, and make sure that that Hitler stays on mainland Europe, on the actual continent. Now, other places where fighting is going on, okay, as you move through 1941. All right. Hitler is eventually going to start to turn on the Soviet Union. I know you might be thinking, well, why is that happening? It seems like that would be pretty dumb. And it is. It's really dumb. But the idea here is, that Hitler, after getting pushed away from Britain, is going to look for expansion elsewhere. And as we know from reading Mein Kampf, that he has this idea of Lebensraum, which is the East, the area in the East, living space, where Aryan master class Germans are going to go and basically rule over Slavs and other Asian races as serfs or slaves. Okay, he also wants to destroy the communist government of the Soviet Union. So in 1941, he extends an attack in the fall of 1941 to go and invade and take the cities, major cities, and the capital, Moscow, of Russia. He's very effective. Once again, he is able to push back the Russians all the way out of Poland, all the way basically to their major cities of Leningrad, and they put it under siege, and also get very, very close to Moscow. But some problems creep up. They basically, like you see in World War I, have very, very stretched thin supply lines. These supply lines are way, way further, to the map, way further away. Look at this supply line, right? I mean, literally 1,000 miles away compared to Berlin to Paris, right? So supplying these troops in the Eastern Front. By the way, this was the largest invasion ever mounted in the history of mankind. It's going to be very, very hard. And it breaks down. There's not enough supplies. The Soviet army also never stops counterattacking. Okay, so they keep throwing over and over and over a fight against Hitler and the German troops. And though they're not necessarily decisive blows, they wear down the supplies and the advance of this blitzkrieg machine. Also, the weather as we get closer to winter, rain and the cold and the snow will bog down the Nazi war machine, and blitzkrieg will officially start to wind down by November 1941. At this point, General Zhukov, Z-H-U-K-O-V, is able to push Germans back from Leningrad and we finally see that Hitler may have overextended his reach. Now, at this point, we need to consider what is driving Hitler. What is causing him to invade Great Britain? What is causing him to invade the Soviet Union? It seems like maybe if he had just been content with his gains, literally of the Reich, literally of the German-speaking peoples, he might have actually won the war. And maybe the Soviet Union would have just given up, or Great Britain would have said, you know what, enough's enough. But they don't. Hitler is hell-bent on pursuing this idea of a new order, or master class ruling over all of the undesirables of Europe. Now, this new order includes an enlarged Germany with a superior German race, and the master class is the superior race. Okay, it's anyone who's German and Aryan compared to the other undesirables. All right, those undesirables would either be killed, specifically if they're Jews or Gypsies, or used as slave labor if they're Slavs or Asiatics. And of course, the process of this killing is named the final solution, the mass extermination of Jews and Gypsies and other undesirables. Okay, once again, that's another name for the Holocaust. There are probably about 6 million Jews who are put to death, or about 75% of the European Jewish population. Initially, as you're probably finding out through your research for your concentration camps, the concentration camp system is truly initially a labor system. And it's actually pretty ineffective as you get later on in the years of the war, because the shooting in mass graves are going too slowly to kill the amount of people that the Nazis want to kill. So they developed the death camp system, extermination camp system at areas like Auschwitz-Birkenau and Chelmno, and some of these other areas, to basically make a machine of killing. And a lot of these pictures that you see are of these death camps, and this is where thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Jews were systematically put to death. These concentration camps were primarily located in Poland, and all of the extermination camps are located in Poland. There's a couple of reasons for this. First, Poland has way more Jews than Germany has. It's the Jewish population. 3 million Jews in Poland, right? So besides this, actually more than the Soviet Union, right? Germany has 565,000, which is probably the most in Western Europe, but there are enormous amounts in Poland. So, if Nazi Germany wanted to bust them all the way into Germany, where there are concentration camps, it would be much harder, right? But to kill 3 million people without having them to, I don't know why I said bust them. They moved them mostly by train. If they wanted to put them in the German concentration camps, that would require a lot more travel. So eventually they made these death camps, and all of these concentration camps were more or less liquidated to go to these extermination camps. I will say at this point that even though we've been saying that the German populace was very aware of what Hitler was doing and more or less turned a blind eye, they're not aware of the crematoriums and the scale of the death and the gas chambers. Very few normal, everyday Germans, are reading on about, oh, how many people were put into the crematorium today, and knew exactly what these areas look like. But they could probably put two and two together, right? It's one of those things like ignorance is bliss, out of sight, out of mind. But still, we can't necessarily say that the majority of Germans knew exactly what was happening in death camps. All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit now and talk about what the United States was doing at this time. Why is the U.S. not involved in the fighting? Why, when Hitler's overrunning all of Europe and Britain's being basically bombed into oblivion, does nothing happen? Well, the big reason is that the American public doesn't want to get involved in the conflict. They're not interested in another war. All right, and so the majority of Americans will support neutrality legislation. And we are way more neutral in World War II than we were in World War I. We do aid the UK a bit in trade because, once again, they are blockading the German ports. But still, it's not overt. It's not as clear that we favor a trade relationship with Great Britain like we did in World War I. Franklin Roosevelt is, of course, the president through the Great Depression and at the start of the World War II. And he actually wants to enter the war and help Britain. He's very aware of the threat to democracy and the threat potentially to the United States that Hitler poses. And so even though we're not at war, Hitler will push Congress to get ready for a possible war in 1940 and 41 by, number one, trading with Great Britain, increasing funds for armed forces, and having the first and only ever peacetime draft. And honestly, this is what pulls the United States out of the Great Depression. War materials that are needed in Europe through the Lend-Lease program is going to make billions of dollars for the U.S. economy. It's going to pull us back into full employment. And it's going to make the U.S. poised and ready for war when we are provoked, which of course will be provoked in 1941. German submarines by the fall of 1941 are sinking American merchant and military ships. And so once again, we're having, the United States being more or less pulled from a neutral position into a war. But it's actually not going to be a German attack that's going to pull the U.S. into the war. As you know, it's going to be a Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. Okay, so Pearl Harbor is, of course, this infamous day that is emblazoned in American memory for all eternity. It actually isn't the most deadly attack on U.S. soil. That would be 9/11. But Pearl Harbor is, at least the first direct attack on a U.S. military base on U.S. soil since the War of 1812, when Washington was attacked. Anyway, we want to get back to how this happened, okay? And basically, we want to pay attention to the souring of relations between Japan and the United States leading up to the end of 1941. Japanese is seeking to increase its control in Asia in 1940. Remember, they're waging a war. They had been for 3 years in China. They have not subdued all of China. Remember, the KMT and CCP are more or less aligned in the interior. And so Japan is going to start moving into the rest of Southeast Asia for its raw materials. So the rest of Southeast Asia would include Indonesia, Thailand, Indochina, like current areas like Vietnam, and the Philippines. And the Philippines, of course, is an area where U.S. has naval bases. So, as they seek to expand, the U.S. and Great Britain are going to try and halt this expansion, not directly by waging war, but by sending supplies by road through Burma, which is a British colony, and then by air from India, okay, to aid the Chinese in fighting the Japanese, so it would divert their attention away from the rest of Southeast Asia. Japan reads the writing on the wall. They sign what is known as the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, and in this pact, each power pledged to aid each other if any was attacked by a new enemy. Now, of course, the new enemy would be the United States, right? So it's basically an agreement that if the U.S. attacks any one of them, the other two will be brought into the war. As 1941 arrives and goes on, Japan continues to push into Southeast Asia. The U.S. will respond by an embargo of aviation fuel and scrap metal, and then it's going to freeze Japanese assets in the United States and begin the talks with Dutch and the British on a mutual defense of Southeast Asia. All right, this is the summer of 1941. So tensions are rising, and as a result of this, the Japanese will develop what we call a two-pronged program. On the one hand, they're going to have an attempt at diplomatic agreements with the U.S. to grant the Japanese access to raw materials in Southeast Asia. And the second part will be that if these diplomatic talks break down, then the Japanese would already have a military plan in place for conquering Southeast Asia outright and getting rid of the U.S. in that area. So, of course, the diplomatic talks do break down. Hideki Tojo will lead the attack on Pearl Harbor December 7th, 1941. And in the morning of this beautiful December morning, the Japanese surprise thousands of U.S. troops and end up sinking quite a few American vessels. 4 battleships sunk, 4 damaged, 3 cruisers damaged, 3 destroyers damaged, 3 other ships damaged. 188 aircraft destroyed, 159 aircraft damaged. In terms of actual death, it's not actually a huge blow. I know that maybe sounds insensitive, but in terms of actual numbers killed, we're looking at close to 2,400 between civilians and soldiers. Now, relative to the actual war, this is going to be just a drop in the bucket. But still, we label it a day which will live in infamy. Right? This is part of Franklin D. Roosevelt's address to Congress, and Congress will oblige him by granting him a declaration of war against Japan. Japan will follow suit and declare war against the United States. And also, within a couple of days, Germany and Italy will also declare war against the United States, honoring the Tripartite Pact. So, and then we, of course, in turn declare war on them, right? So, we did not declare war on Germany first. Germany actually declares war on us first, as it's honoring the Tripartite Pact. The first 5 months after we're at war with Japan are pretty good for the Japanese. They make enormous territorial gains in Southeast Asia. They drive all of the Western powers out of this area. They capture the Philippines from the U.S., and this is where famed U.S. General Douglas MacArthur is pushed off, but threatens to return and whip up the Japanese, which he does later on. The Japanese also bombed the U.S. Pacific Fleet into basic, uselessness. They don't hit our aircraft carriers, which was a key miss. Thailand will be conquered. The British will be driven from Burma and Malaya. Indonesia will be overrun, and the Dutch will be lost. And Australia will be the next that is threatened. So, as we can see, the Japanese Empire is going to be enormous. Let me get a map here at its height. Here's a great one. At its height, it is way, way bigger than Germany's. Here we go, mid-1942. This is the extent of it, right? It extends all the way from the Aleutian Islands, which are part of Alaska, right, through the Marshall Islands, the Philippines, Guam, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Indonesia here, right, Malayan Peninsula, Indochina, Thailand, Burma, and then, of course, the coast of China and Manchuria. So this is an enormous piece of territory, both in terms of landmass and, of course, in terms of sea control. And this is way, way more than Germany ever even hoped to get in their actual expansion of their Reich to form this new order over in Europe. All right, that's it for part one. Good luck with the questions, and feel free to come see me if any questions. Thanks.